Hi, this is an introduction to logic. My name is Mark Thorsby, and today we're going to be talking about language and the varieties of meaning. Which, if you're following along, we're using the Patrick Hurley textbook, and that's section 2.1. So, welcome back, everyone. I hope you're doing well. Let me get my thing up here. I hope everyone's doing well. Today we're looking at varieties of meaning. So in this section, which we're beginning, and we're just doing chapter 2 here, we're going to be sort of asking the question of how is meaning constructed within the words we use? Because one of the things we're going to see is that oftentimes when someone says something, they mean multiple things. For instance, I'm sure you noticed, for instance, when we looked at some of the arguments from the first chapter, chapter 1, that oftentimes some of them would have smuggle in assumptions about certain sorts of things. For instance, consider the complex question, um, in which someone asks something that has two meanings simultaneously. So, imagine, for instance, someone says to you, have you stopped stealing money from work? No matter how you answer that question, um, there's actually two questions happening simultaneously. Number one is did you actually steal money? And number two is, have you stopped doing it? So, a complex question reveals that with a single utterance, a statement can do multiple sorts of things. And another thing is, for instance, I've asked you to sort of throughout the term to take a look at the arguments you hear in your actual daily life. And one of the things you'll find is a lot of those arguments are very passionate, and there's emotional things that come into play. For instance, anyone who loves to talk about politics, I'm one of these people. I love having a political discussion around dinner table at night with my family. But oftentimes, those sorts of conversations can get very passionate, and emotions come into play. And so, one of the things we're going to have to take a look at here is that if we want to understand how our arguments can work such that some of those arguments are valid and some of those arguments are invalid, or some of those arguments are strong or weak, if we're going to assess whether or not an argument is logical, we have to begin by understanding a little bit more about how our language works and the type of things that happen in terms of meaning. And here, for instance, I want you to consider the idea that think about the notion of persuasion, for instance, right? A lot of the arguments we hear are arguments of persuasion. That is, they're arguments which attempt to convince us of a specific sort of conclusion. Um, Compare this with, for instance, arguments that are purely about information. So, for instance, you can imagine if you're trying to find out if you're doing your taxes and you have a question about why such and such is the case, or someone makes an argument about how you should file your taxes, they may give you information. They say, listen, this is how, if you file in this sense, this is how much will be deducted out of your paycheck, et cetera, et cetera. But that would be an argument or a discussion or a discourse that's focused on conveying information versus persuading someone to believe something. So, like, for instance, consider, at least hopefully, in a court of law, it's these sorts of arguments that have credence, not the persuasive arguments. Now, there is a fair degree amount of persuasion that, of course, goes on in a courtroom. So you can see different ways in which we use our language. So, and then, by the way, I think in logic, this is a really critical distinction: persuasion versus information. Or it's not the nicest way of maybe explaining that distinction, but two types of discourse. You have informative discourse and you have persuasive discourse. I think that would be the more technical way of understanding the distinction. Now, what I want to do here is talk about some of the different types of meaning, because we're going to see that it's actually a lot more complicated than you might think. And we're going to distinguish between really two critical types, though there's other types of meaning. At least claims can either have cognitive meaning, or they can have emotive meaning. So, for instance, an argument or a discourse that well, go back up here when we talked about persuasion. Ultimately, the cognitive meaning concerns the information that's conveyed in the words that's used within an argument or a statement. So you can say this is that the cognitive meaning is the information claim that a person is making when they, engage in such and such a discourse or make an argument. By contrast, the emotive meaning, you can see here the emotive, we're talking about emotions here, right? So, what does the emotive mean? Well, the emotive meaning comes out in the value assumptions that are laden within the language, and oftentimes this is the parts that rely on emotion. So, for instance, let me talk a little bit about what a value claim is, because the emotive meaning concerns the value claim that's given through the language and typically not explicitly, right? So what is a value claim? Well, a value claim is when somehow some sort of good is asserted. I'll just put I'll put it some sort of asserted good. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean that, for instance, let's go take a look at the example that the book has here. So, by the way, this is the Aptly system we're using here, which can be access can be purchased directly through SiteGauge, I believe. Okay, so let's sort of scroll down here to the emotive meaning. Give the example they have here. Let's take the example. Okay, here's an example. The death penalty is a cruel and inhuman form of punishment in which hapless prisoners are dragged from their cells and summarily slaughtered only to satiate the bloodlust of a vengeful public. Right? Well, that clearly there's a lot of emotive language and there's a lot of going on there in which they're clearly against the death penalty, right? All reference to the death penalty here is referred to as inhuman, and there's a whole litany of colorful language, summarily slaughtered, etc. The satiated bloodlust, right? All of this language hides the value claim that ultimately this person who's making this argument values that or thinks that asserts a good, and in this case, the good is that the death penalty is a bad thing, right? That's the value that's being made there. Now that sounds sort of odd the way I phrased that there, right? But that's ultimately the idea. Is the value claim here is that the death penalty is a bad sort of thing, and they're using language in this example that ultimately um, forces you to either concede to that assumption, that value, and you can think of it that way, that there's an assumed value here, right? And so what we need to do is when we see a phrase like this, we have to disentangle the cognitive meaning from the emotive meaning. So let's go back here. Let's see, where am I? Sorry, right? So the emotive. So for example, so the example with the cognitive meaning. If we go back to the example, the cognitive meaning there was that the death penalty should be abolished. I think that's the cognitive meaning of the that example. But what's the emotive meaning is that the death penalty um, is an evil, right, or something like that. So the emotive meaning is the value claim that's ultimately asserted through some sort of emotional trappings of language, and the cognitive meaning is what's actually being asserted as the conclusion in this case. So when we disentangle the cognitive from the emotive meaning, and by understanding that distinction, we're going to be in a better position to evaluate arguments, because oftentimes, especially in the course of our lives, people are giving us arguments that have lots and lots of emotive meaning, sometimes not very good cognitive meaning. Other times, people have great cognitive meaning, but it's unclear in terms of how to assess their argument because it's so laden with value terms, right? So the thing we're going to have to learn how to do in logic is really go back and disentangle this so that we can actually understand to assess what someone's actually arguing, right? Because the emotive meaning or the emotive language, I should say, typically mask. Um, Typically, what it does is it masks what the logical content of the argument is. So, for instance, think about advertising. right? Some of you may be even going into advertising, right? Advertising typically utilizes a high degree of emotive language. Now, uh, advertising also uses visual stimuli, and if we might say a sort of visual language. And so clearly advertising also pulls in the direction of using visual emotive vocabulary, if you will. But in terms of logic, we're just going to really focus in this class on emotive language. So advertising is a good example. So for instance, if someone describes uh, uh, imagine, for instance, a television commercial that's trying to sell someone to go to a certain sort of menu deal at a restaurant, and the way they might describe the restaurant experience, right? Or the way they might describe the food, right? In a very flowery language. It sounds really nice. So emotive language, for instance, is heavily used in advertisement. And it's interesting. I would also say a good example here would be political advertisement, actually, too, where there's a lot of emotive language, especially of the type we saw earlier. So that's sort of interesting. One of the examples would be, for instance, think about the word harvest, right? For instance, in medical ethics, or in terms of when a patient dies in a hospital and the hospital would like to ask for organ donation, right? Or if someone does donate their organs upon their death to a hospital to use for organ transplantation purposes, they don't refer to they don't the way they refer to it is a harvest. So they say we're going to harvest the organs, and that sounds really nice because a harvest, brings this image of Thanksgiving time and people coming together in this sort of kind of a very rich heritage that word conjures up for us, which is a very positive sort of thing in general, the harvest, right? Because that's when comes back and there's more plenty, right? But the problem is like that's not what's actually happening in a hospital. They're actually cutting a person open and cutting out their organs, and it's fairly grisly and horrible. It looks more like butchering than it does harvesting. Yet we use that language to refer to it ultimately as a euphemism for avoiding talking about the sort of dark, grisly nature of the term of what we're doing when we harvest organs, but instead to sort of provide a sort of emotive overtone. And so that's a sort of interesting example here. I think your book used that example, but not medical ethics, which I think is fairly interesting. So what do I want to say in general here as we go forward? How are we going to? What are the steps of analysis that we should use now that we're thinking about the difference between the cognitive meaning and the emotive meaning of a statement or a claim? Well, I think there's a number of steps you do. The first thing, again, when you look at an argument, is always ask, well, what is the conclusion? And distinguish the premises. You want to definitely distinguish the premises from the conclusion. So that way you can evaluate what the relationship is between what they're claiming and what the evidence they're giving is, and understanding that how that evidence is presented. If it's heavily fortified in emotive language, then you slowly be able to better understand or evaluate the arguments. So once you get the conclusion, this next thing to do is to differentiate the meanings. Right? And so you want to understand exactly, or you want to isolate what the cognitive meaning is, as well as what the emotive meaning is. And number 3 here is next what you want to do is you want to rephrase the argument using only the cognitive language. I'll just put it as cognitive for you. Right? So I'm sorry, my handwriting, it's hard to write on this. But we have, for the steps analysis, first says what's the conclusion, then evaluate differentiate the meanings, what's the cognitive meaning, what's the emotive meaning. Now, when you evaluate the emotive meaning, what you're going to want to do is also evaluate what exactly is the value claim that's being assumed in the emotive language, right? And by understanding what the value claim is, that's what's going to enable you to rephrase the argument in a cognitive fashion. So let me sort of jump over here and see if we can, let's see here. Um, Take a look at the textbook here. Now, again, this is the 12th edition that I'm actually looking at right now. Whoops, let me scroll down here. Oh, one moment, sorry. Scroll down here and take a look at the exercise set that is given here. So let's take a look here. So there's two sorts of things. That the first thing in your homework is there's this speech taken from George Wallace, who was the governor of Alabama. And this speech was given on July 4th, 1964. And what he does is he attacks Lyndon Johnson's signing of the Civil Rights Act. It's actually a very, very famous speech. But it's heavily laden with value language. So, for instance, um, the first thing that you're essentially asked to do is to evaluate this speech, right? So what you want to do is, number one, is make a list of what you consider to be the 25 most highly charged words or phrases, and then indicate what they're intended to evoke, whether it's favorable attitude or not, and I basically isolate what the value claims are. And so that's what you have to do. This. I'm not going to sit here and go through this because it'll take too long, but it's a really good exercise to do because we're constantly confronted with things like this. Obviously, maybe not to the same degree the Wallace speech is. But section 2 here, what we'll do is we'll take a couple of the examples. So the following selections were taken from letters to the editor section of the newspaper. So keep in mind, this is real, right? People really actually do think these things, right? So this is the way people actually argue. Now, each of these can be interpreted as expressed in one or more arguments. And what you're supposed to do is first begin identifying the conclusion. Then you need to disengage. I like the language here. Then you need to disengage the covert assumptions, the value claims, and any other cognitive assertions from the emotive language, and then translate it into emotively neutral premises. So use the two examples in the text as models. Okay, so let's take this first example and take a look at it. So the person argues, why don't animal lovers do something about these dog sled races? Have you ever witnessed a race on television? Talk about torture. It's sickening to watch the dogs, panting and their tongues hanging out, pull a heavily laden sled with the driver through the snow and ice and bitter cold. So this is what Joe Shapiro thinks, right? So for instance, you can see here it starts off with questions, right? And then talks about torture, right? Have you ever witnessed one on television? It's sickening to watch, okay? So the sickening here, clearly the emotive, this is all emotive language, right? In terms of the sickening part. That's an emotive term that's getting used right here. Well, torture, it could be, right? This actually could be part of the argument. Let's see. Yeah, a heavily laden sled, right? It's not, well, it's probably heavy, but it's probably not heavy at the end of the race. Um, and so on and so forth, right? And why don't these animal lovers, right? You can see that usually people don't refer to someone as an animal lover in I don't know, in a professional sense, I suppose, right? So what's the emotive meaning? The emotive meaning is basically that centers around the value assumption that sled racing mistreats animals and that's wrong. That's ultimately what they think. That's the assumption that they're making, is that it's wrong, and they believe that that's the value, right? But what's the cognitive meaning? The cognitive meaning here, because there is cognitive meaning, is number one is that that the ultimate, I think, the conclusion here is basically that sled racing is a form of torture. That seems to be the conclusion, and the argument seems to be that it is a form of torture because the animals are pulling heavy sleds um, through the snow in rough conditions, and they're panting. Now, I'm not sure about the panting. Now, I think that's the argument. Now, the question is whether or not ultimately panting it consists of torture for a dog, and I don't think so, because that's how dogs cool themselves. So, but it obviously shows strenuous activity on the part of the dog. So I think the argument here is basically that that it's a form of torture because of the difficulties. Now, is that a good argument? I don't think it's that good of an argument, frankly, in terms of its cognitive relationship. Is it emotive? Yeah, it's definitely emotive. So let's see. How does the book define it? Let's see. Right? In dog sled races, the dogs are tortured. Torturing animals is morally wrong. Therefore, uh, dog sled races are morally wrong. Okay, so you can see how this was done is ultimately the conclusion. Ultimately, here the author says, here the author suggests that we should bring the value laden claim, the value assumption, into the form of the argument, right? I think that you could analyze this argument though in more specific terms, the way I laid it out. I don't. So there's two arguments, and I'm not sure that this person is arguing about the giving evidence for the moral implications of it. They just seem to be assuming it now. So this brings it out. So let's take a look at another one here. Now you can see here that these ones are difficult because part of what's happening here is we're asking and evaluating these arguments, and there's no clean way to do it because we're not using a form of formal logic here. But let's take a look at number two. How anyone who has seen even one photo of the fly-covered starving children in Somalia can still believe in loving, ever-present, omnipotent God is beyond intelligent reasoning, right? So now distinguish what is the emotive claim and what's the cognitive claim, right? Well, clearly this person, the cognitive claim here, or I think the argument ultimately, there's a lot of emotive language here. Anything that starts with the sort of question, how anyone is seen to be starving on children is loving, right? Starts off with a question here. So a question automatically reveals that the assumption here is that you should obviously agree with this. Now, I don't think that's sufficient. What is the actual argument here? The argument is essentially what we call the problem of evil, which is namely, if God is an all loving, ever present, omnipotent God, um, then there should not be a um, there should not be a world with evil in it. There is a world with evil in it insofar as there are starving children in Somalia. Therefore, there is no God, right? Something like that. That's ultimately the argument. Now, I sort of put that, I believe, in a hypothetical syllogism. You could rephrase it in different ways, right? But that's ultimately what their argument is, but it's all being implied in a question, right? Let's take a look at one last more. Let's take a look here. God, guts, and guns made this great country of ours free, and you can bet your buns it will take more of the same to keep it that way. One of the very last things in this world we need is handgun control. Okay, so this person clearly the emotive language is built around the value assumption that um, guns should be protected. The gun rights should be protected, right? And that there's a constitutional history of it and so forth is how they're arguing it, right? Um, so the question then becomes, well, what exactly is the cognitive meaning? So, for instance, it could be rephrased like this: free ownership of guns is as noble as a belief in God. I'm sorry. Free ownership of guns is as noble as belief in God and in intestinal fortitude. Belief in God and intestinal fortitude made our country great and free. Continued belief in God and intestinal fortitude are necessary to keep our country the way it is. Free ownership of guns is no less important than God and intestinal fortitude. Therefore, gun control is wrong. Right now, you can see what they've done here is because that's now why is it they keep saying intestinal fortitude? Because it said God, guts, and guns. God, guts, and guns. So at the beginning, this phrase actually made guts become a primary element of the argument, because this is what they're actually saying. They're actually saying that it's God, your intestinal fortitude is the way it's translated here, and gun ownership ultimately is what makes our country great. And what they've done is they've separated out this argument, all of these things, and laid it out. Now, there's different ways to do these, I think. Now, for those of you doing these in Applia, you'll find that it's a little bit easier in the sense that it's sort of set up for you more so. But for those of you doing the homework exercises directly from the book, you're going to find out that there's going to be different ways of rephrasing these. And then in the last section here, this is sort of interesting. I don't think that this would be an interesting assignment. Is visit a drugstore and find an aisle that displays hair products, and then take a look at which ones have emotional meaning and how so, right? So that's sort of interesting stuff. So anyway, that's enough for us today. That's 2.1 Varieties of Meaning. Thank you guys for watching. I hope this was informative or helpful. See you guys later.